Good morning and welcome to Levy Digital Desk. I'm your host, Sarah Good. This morning, we're going to be talking about last night at the RNC, night 4. It was the final night where we heard Trump speak for the first time since the attempted assassination. We're going to have Ben Mileski back on with us today. Dr. Benjamin Mileski is with the Political Science Department at Old Dominion University. He was with us on Tuesday taking a look at last weekend as well as the first day of the RNC. But now, as the week continues, we're hearing increasing calls of people pretty high up in the Democratic Party talking about Biden and his calls for him to exit. So we're going to get opinions on that and hear a little bit about what you're seeing on screen right now, what you heard last night in Trump's speech. So I'm going to bring Ben on now. Thank you so much for joining us back just a few days later.
Good morning.
I just want, first thing is, and I'll pull up on screen in a second, on Tuesday, we were sort of, forecasting what Trump potentially might talk about. We were talking about themes of unity and different things that people were saying he changed the tune of his speech. He was rewriting it. What did you hear last night and what were your thoughts?
I think last night, you'll hear it in the media today. It was kind of a tale of two Trumps, right? And I think for the first 20, 25 minutes of his speech, he did exactly what both his campaign and kind of the rumors bandied about were saying was we saw a much softer Trump. We saw one more introspective and reflective on kind of the events of the weekend. We saw some really powerful moments speaking to the victims of the events of Saturday. There's going to be a picture that I think will go down in history of him going over to um, the firefighter's uniform from the individual who was killed on Saturday and kind of respecting it and giving it a kiss. I mean, I think that's going to be very powerful. However, then after kind of the recounting of those events, then I think we kind of shifted more back to more of a standard campaign Trump that we saw out on the campaign trail. Maybe not always sticking to the script, ad-libbing for probably about a good 30-ish minutes of the hour and 32 minutes he spoke. And kind of really then hitting on the planks of the platform that his party and his campaign are putting forward.
And we're seeing it here. And I think obviously with the base there was a lot of cheering. But he, even in the beginning, as you said, the first half, didn't really get into the cheering or the rally cries. It was subdued in his tone. And it seemed to be very on script, which we haven't seen in a while. Do you think there was a certain thing that maybe switched that? Is that just, going back into his usual tenor? I mean, what did you think maybe made that shift from the more subdued beginning to that more hour-long speech that he gave?
I think there's two elements to it. The first is, I mean, it's frankly, it's personality. I mean, this is who Donald Trump is, right? I mean, it meets our perceptions of what we know the candidate is from, he's been on the public stage for a long time. And it's very hard to change your fundamental nature, right? And it's also hard to break that perception amongst the public as well, too. The second element also, I think, is just the energy in there. We've heard reports all week that the energy of the RNC was basically not seen last in a party since like the 2008 Obama convention, right? So I think that energy is infectious. And there is something to the fact that when you're standing before a packed house that is just buzzing with that energy and we can talk about political unification, right? Party unification that night. You fall back into your tendencies and really thrive off of that energy.
And, I think in the midst of him giving his speech, we're hearing him from the first time after the assassination attempt, and we were hearing cheers throughout by different speakers, even leading up. His son did this as well, and some other people. The fight, fight, fight chant that, is now becoming sort of this, rallying cry of strength that we're seeing. Do you think that strength was shown last night, especially, in the backdrop when a lot of people are talking about, the strength of Biden?
hmm Yeah, I mean, if you just look at, kind of the theme of the week, right? Each day had kind of a different theme, going from um, wealth and prosperity to strength and security to this night being very much focused on strength and strength through unity, strength through, in some instances, humility, right? I mean, Donald Trump used the word humble, which I don't think anyone really expected. And you look at the speakers leading up to his speech. I mean, you're bringing in people like Hulk Hogan and Dana White, right? People that are entertainers and people that are focused in industries that, are pervasive of strength. So I very much think that it was purposeful, and it very much does reflect kind of the tenure going for or the tenor of the campaign going forward.
And some of those people that spoke for Trump, those figures that a lot of America will know, they're a part of pop culture. Do you think that's trying to get more people, I guess, involved that maybe is not a part of his base? Because as much as he's speaking to the delegates in the room, he also is speaking to millions of Americans at home that are watching this or watching this maybe in clips on social media the next day on YouTube. I mean, what do you think the gain is there?
So if you look at kind of Wednesday night when JD Vance spoke, that was very much from the context and the tenor of his speech. That was an olive branch out to an expansion of the electorate, right? Speaking to what Trump was able to do back in 2016, reaching to Rust Belt voters, reaching to voters that maybe the Democratic Party has left behind through policy or just believing that perhaps that they are maybe taken for granted. They'll just come out and naturally vote for Democrats. And that's what I think JD Vance's speech was very much focused on. If you look at the context and kind of tenor of this speech from Trump, it wasn't so much about expansion of the electorate. I think this was very much more about reaching out to part of his base. That might be those low propensity voters, ones that might sit on the couch and stay in on election day. And if you put this in the context of where we are in the race, you look at, pretty much any national news network, larger polling firms, they're projecting out to the race to 2020 or 270, right? To how many electoral votes you need to win the presidency. And right now, Donald Trump is effectively ahead, right? I mean, this is the first time he's really ever been ahead at this point in any of his presidential campaigns. And in terms of what he needs to do, in particular in battleground states, he really only needs to get 46, 47% of the vote. And that's basically bring out your base. And I think what he did last night, I mean, there was a lot of kind of, you throw red meat to the party. That's expected at a convention. But by bringing out speakers like Dana White and Hulk Hogan and speaking in the way he did, speaking, bringing out a connection to pop culture and cultural events and bringing in religious leaders like Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, you're really trying to get out those voters who might sit on the sidelines. And you just got to get to that 47% basically, because you have people like RFK, potentially Cornel West, Jill Stein, that are going to be in there sucking up some of those middle votes.
And throughout the week, you're talking about the side right there, but then the other side of it is they were trying, I think, to maybe show the more human side, if you will, with the family, with the granddaughter speaking. Do you think that's something that came through at all in his speech? Maybe perhaps, speaking about the firefighter who lost his life. I mean, that was definitely a human element. But do you think that grabbed at anyone that maybe wasn't in his camp before?
Um, it's tough. We're gonna have to wait to see. I know there was some kind of flash focus grouping after the fact amongst independents and amongst undecided. Um, some of the flash polling that I saw in Wisconsin, it impacted some voters, but not a ton, right? So it's going to maybe work around the edges. And for the Trump campaign, I think that's a strong strategy, right? Like if you can get your base out and then maybe pick up some votes around the edges, you don't have to win much. I mean, you look at some, go back to the 2016 election and some of these battleground counties and precincts, right? I mean, they are only won by small margins of votes, and that's all he has to do again. So if you can humanize Trump through your granddaughter, through Dana White even saying, I was on vacation and he was, apologetic that he was asking me to speak for him, and leave my vacation. And I think that might bring in some votes around the edges.
And I want to move to, while we have some time, this part, and Biden's coming up on screen here. The calls for Biden to exit, I think, have grown really all week. We've heard from people further up in the Democratic Party. Now, I think even this morning, honestly, we're hearing so many mixed reports. It's hard to sort of read between the lines of what's out there and all these different sources that people are citing of what's really real. I think even this morning, there was a note from maybe a campaign, either manager or somebody inside the campaign saying, no, he's really much going forward with this, but then you're hearing consistently across the board that he is maybe taking it more seriously to look at what people are asking him to do and potentially exit. I mean, what are you hearing and how do you feel about the calls?
From both the larger media as well as some individuals I've kind of talked to, um, there's a lot of smoke, right? And there's nothing definite. I know there's some reporting, in social media saying, he in the next 72 hours will be withdrawing. I guess there's reports that his wife has canceled a campaign stop in Ann Arbor, which was scheduled for Sunday. Um, and the reality is, I think Biden has to take a little bit of a, step back and, take everything in context. He's looked at least some of the reporting we've heard is that he's looked at some of the polling data and said, look, I'm still running neck and neck in some places, right? Polling is just a snapshot of right now, right? Things can get turned around very quickly. Um, but you look at other things, like there are reports out and credible reports that the major donors to the Democratic Party, as well as the Biden campaign, have basically turned off the faucet. And especially if they're turning off the faucet for not just his campaign, but Democrats down ballot and expecting, or at least arguing that, they may lose terrifically in the House and the Senate. So why throw good money at bad, right? Um, this is something that the president has to do a little bit of introspection on and, say what is kind of the best thing for the party as a whole. And further, what is the best thing for his legacy? Does he want to go down as, if potentially, at least if you listen to some of the narrative, right? If he withdraws now and kind of falls on the sword for the party, right, he gets viewed in a much more favorable light than if he tries to stick it out and either, goes all the way to election day and maybe loses terrifically. Then that kind of tarnishes a legacy that he's really built.
And speaking of the power of sort of this, pop culture and public figures, it was just last week when George Clooney wrote a very sort of pro Biden stepping down and also a very colorful opinion piece about, this Biden is not the Biden we've seen before. Do you think those voices and that kind of power can influence other people, or is that more towards voters and then maybe this was a thought that people in the government and in the Democratic Party have been having. It's just that now it's been vocalized.
Yeah, I mean, so there's very much when we think about how a kind of a party is, right, there are these kind of concentric circles, right? And what George Clooney and kind of others in kind of the pop culture and media are they're kind of almost a mouthpiece or a surrogate for the voters, right? I mean, they themselves are cultural elites, but they're very much tapped into the electorate. They're very much tapped into their fans, and they're saying things that effectively, they're saying the quiet part out loud, and the quiet part is very much what the donor class. And we've heard, numerous calls from governors and Democratic senators who are in battleground districts and states that they have been vocalizing quietly to the president, right? Behind the scenes. So, um, as however that starts to bubble up, we're starting to see more and more political officials, right, now take the public stage as opposed to just behind the scenes, voicing their concerns and actually coming out and basically saying that there is no path forward for Joe Biden.
And it was interesting. I think a lot of people have started to think back in history. Where in the history of presidents of the United States have we been in a similar boat? And there was examples, I believe, Woodrow Wilson, and talking about, medical things that have come up again with FDR, I think, and they said, wartime, we don't need to tell the public about, any ailments. I mean, I think, but now in this culture of transparency, and as we've talked about, to the minute, to the second, even sometimes knowledge of what's going on, you can't hide what's happening.
No. And even a rumor has power in these days, right? So with the kind of the spread of social media and instant information and instant gratification of that information, um, a rumor, a whisper has power. And even false information, as we talked about on Tuesday, right, has power as well too. So it's one of these things that the current president really, like I said, is doing some introspection. We have basically a month until the DNC, so the Democratic Party does have some time to course correct. Um, what is the best option is difficult, right? I mean, there are both pros and cons to either going straight forward with Kamala Harris or going to some sort of open convention and seeing what happens there. Um, However, even though it's still a month to the DNC, it's not that far until election day, right? So there's only so much you can do. However, there are some indicators that could help the Democrats. Some of the polling that's come out shows that about 80% of Democrats would vote for Kamala Harris if she was the substitute nominee. So, I mean, right now the Republicans are looking at, we talk about unification. It's party unification, right? The Republican Party is unified last night and throughout this convention. The Democrats have a chance to bring up and bring back unification of the party, but right now they are so splintered and fractured across states, across concentric circles of the party, that they have to act sooner rather than later.
And with the Republican Party, I think there's a lot of big names right now that are very vocal, that are out there. In any case, if Trump couldn't have been, for whatever reason, the nominee, there are names in politics of people that could step up, that would run for president, obviously, as we've seen throughout this primary year. But in the Democratic camp, it seems there's not as many known figures, at least to a lot of Americans. I mean, I think Whitmer is one person that's been thrown out there, Newsom, but there is some baggage, with Newsom that comes with that, how people feel. And besides that, you talked about on Tuesday how, Kamala's name is so obviously known by the American public, that she has that leg up, I guess, in that case of people knowing and identifying who she is. But are we in a situation where there's really not that many options currently in the Democratic Party that are, sort of public favorites?
Mhm. And there's also, maybe it's not the public favorites part, but it's also for the people that are in the party that are, potentially thinking about throwing their hat in. It's kind of a why do you want to shoot your shot now, right? You have, I think it's what, 106, 116, 117 days to election day. If you're a potential rising star in the Democratic Party, right? I mean, so some names have been thrown around are Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania. We've heard about Kathy Hochul from New York. I mean, obviously Whitmer, Newsom. Um, do you really want to throw your hat into the ring now with a very short campaign and potentially, lose maybe historically, and then shoot yourself in the foot for a 2028 chance?
Right. And that 2028 number for Republicans, too, we're seeing those people already come out of the woodwork, sort of maybe planting the seeds of who they are, or at least we can guess, who those people are. So I understand that side of it as well. The last thing I want to say before we go is just if this were to unfold, it's not going to be smooth, right? Whatever happens next week, if those calls for him to exit are true, he does end up stepping down. That is chaotic, not only for the election coming in November, but that's also a extremely chaotic moment, just for the country, especially, I guess we'd hope, right, that he would continue to be the president through January. But there's a lot of questions up in the air with calls for him to step down.
So I guess the connection there is that if the president is potentially unfit, at least in the eyes of the party, right, to be the nominee and run for another full term, is he still fit to be commander in chief, right? Is there, medical issues? Is there cognitive issues? Is there something below the scenes or below what we see that might impair his ability to actually be the president? And that's a very different and scary question, right? And that's something that the party is going to have to wrestle with, especially with the optics of a withdrawal. Um, so it's messy one way or the other. If he stays in, it's messy getting to the convention. It's messy then if he were to say withdraw, after the convention before election day. It's messy if he stays in and then say something terrible happens medically or cognitively before election day. It's messy if he withdraws, and then who becomes the nominee. If Kamala becomes the nominee, there's a connection there that, yeah, she can bring, $90 million of unspent campaign war chest funds to the table. Um, but there's a view that maybe she's, kind of the unelected nominee. She didn't go through the kind of the standard primary process, and that gets messy and causes divisions. If she gets sidestepped, right, and they, bring somebody like a Newsom or a Whitmer forward, then you run into the messiness of, did the first potentially black woman to become the president get shunted to the side for, somebody else, right? And that splinter the party. So the the path moving forward for the Democrat Party is a bit fraught right now. And that's why I think, like I said, the president's being introspective. There's a lot of talk behind the scenes amongst the donor class and the political elites about what to do. And they're trying to find that way forward that is the least messy.
Well, we'll see what happens, and if anything were to happen over the weekend, I think that we'll, bring back some opinion next week to see how everything is going to move forward. But Ben, thank you so much again for joining us this morning, giving us your insights to a very tumultuous week in politics.
My pleasure as always.
And thank you to everyone watching. There's plenty of links up on wavy.com to bring you to where we stand right now, as well as looking forward at potentially what could happen. So feel free to go over to wavy.com and we'll keep you updated as things progress here in this election cycle. But Ben, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for watching.